Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you profoundly, Ambassador Cohen. Thanks for the generous introduction, but thank you also for the terrific job that you are doing and the support you give to our staff here in Egypt. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks also to President Dalal. Thank you so much for your leadership of the university and for everyone at AUC. You've all been extraordinarily helpful. And thank you for dealing with the continuing complications of appearing in surgical masks, sitting seats apart from each other. And I very much appreciate your coming here today. And I want to honor my good friend, Amr Moussa, who was the General Secretary of the Arab League, and so much more. And I appreciate him for being here. At the outset, let me just say this. We all know that the world is appropriately focused in following the situation in Ukraine, where critical values and countless lives are at stake. That keeps our focus, in some ways, away from this. But today, I am here to talk about another threat, a real threat, to our planet as a whole and our changing climate. It's an honor for me to be here and to be able to speak from a stage, by the way, where the great musician Louis Armstrong once played jazz. So it's a pleasure to look out and see the view that he saw once, a long time ago. Just another example, I might add, of how this institution has led the way for more than a century, including on climate, the first university in the region to track the carbon footprint. And you have your Center for Applied Research on the Environment and Sustainability. And speaking of leading the way, I'm particularly glad that we're joined here by students in the Tomorrow's Leaders program and young climate leaders of the Ambassadors Youth Council. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your leadership. On behalf of President Biden, I bring you all the goodwill of the United States, and I bring you a greeting of peace in the midst of an ongoing pandemic and uncertainty. Assalamu alaikum. It is really good to be here, some 8 months before Egypt will host COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I come here now because these 8 months are filled with promise and with challenge. And it is imperative that we, all of us, do everything in our power to give life to the many commitments of Glasgow. We must make these 8 months count, and count in a way that you may not be contemplating today, but fight with all of the passion and the energy that we can summon. Not because President Biden or I say so, but because scientists around the world are joined together in compiling evidence that is screaming at us to protect the planet and to act now before the worst consequences of the climate crisis are unavoidable. Now, you're preparing to host delegates and stakeholders from around the world for what is, with no exaggeration, a continuation of one of the most important conversations in the history of human beings. It's particularly fitting to gather in Egypt, known as the Mother of the Earth, Mother of the World. Not far from here, our forebears established much of early world civilization. You know that. But it's worth focusing on it because it embodied not just the physical wonders of magnificent pyramids, which are obvious to everybody, but also innovations and traditions that endure today, including just the fact of days of 24 hours, years of 365 days, and a world that could be measured with algebra. Just a few. This early history is its own monument to human dignity, to human ingenuity, to human capacity, And the hosts of COP this next November, in that role, Egypt can help us all take the next critical steps to save civilization. You may think that's pretty highly blown language, but it's not an exaggeration. Ancient Egyptians revered the earth, from the sun and the moon to the birds and cats, reeds and serpents and waters, all of it kept holy and sacred. Still today, many people consider protecting our planet as a matter of faith responsibility. Remember, all of the children of Abraham share in this teaching, as do many spiritual and philosophical traditions. We are instructed through the earliest scripture, literature, and storytelling to be stewards of the earth, caretakers. But there's another principle that unites our ancestors with the modern world, a belief that as we listen to and learn from one another, we have to be honest with each other. In ancient times, the rising and the setting of the sun was a daily battle between the god Ra and a giant serpent, the, quote, enemy of truth and light. Today, it is scientists who fight that daily battle to understand and expose the forces that shape our world, from a terrible disease to changes in our climate that now threaten all of us. So it's up to us to learn from them and be honest about the reality that as caretakers, we are falling woefully short. As Albert Einstein, who, by the way, knew a thing or two about science and scientific discovery, as he put it, science can ascertain what is, but not what should be. It's up to all of us to decide what will be through our action or our inaction. That's what the fight to prevent climate devastation really boils down to. It's the challenge to secure a healthier, cleaner, safer, less polluted planet while we still can. And as someone who has seen 26 COPs come and go, I know how difficult it can be to find consensus. But I am an optimist about what we've achieved last November in Glasgow if we build on it. Almost 200 nations came together and took unprecedented steps in the cause of the climate battle. Those 200 nations resolved together, and that's not an easy thing, as Amar will tell you, pulling 200 nations with different economies and different hopes, different capacities together. But they agreed to pursue efforts to limit the Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and agreed that that would require reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a minimum of 45% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. My friends, if we don't do this, not as a matter of politics or ideology, but if we don't do this, we will blow through that 1.5 degree limit, and we would likely be not able to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. That is a reality. Glasgow produced unprecedented private sector commitments to action. It identified trillions of dollars of investment available for the energy transition, provided we take the right steps to actually deploy those trillions of dollars, provided the governments put in place the incentives, the transparency, the accountability required to create confidence. There can be no doubt, and I say this having been to most of the other COPs, we did come out of Glasgow with momentum. Momentum if countries put commitments into action. Momentum if outlier countries which haven't strengthened their commitments do so in the months ahead. Momentum if 111 countries that have signed a pledge to reduce methane by 30% globally actually do so. Momentum if the private sector follows through on the historic commitments made in Glasgow, and momentum if the first ever global consensus on phasing down coal and fossil fuel subsidies actually leads to the biggest energy transformation since the Industrial Revolution. Now, yes, I realize that's a lot of ifs. But my friends, momentum has never been a guarantee. It's the gift of opportunity, and it's up to us to make the most of that opportunity. The job on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh and beyond is to turn every one of those ifs into imperatives. It's to turn pledges into proof of concept, and it is to hold everyone accountable. And all of this has to be done with a much greater sense of emergency than today, because we literally are running out of time to avoid irreversible impacts. I say that with the following in mind. Here is what we know. We know last year brought us the hottest month humans have ever recorded. We know this past decade was the hottest in history. We know the decade before that was the second hottest in history. And the one before that was the third hottest in history. So we actually know that in the simplest terms, that constitutes a trend. And it's one screaming at us to pay attention to. Now, often you hear concerns about the costs and difficulties of acting on climate. Well, consider what we know about the costs of inaction. We know that last year in the United States alone, extreme weather took almost 700 lives and cost more than $145 billion in damages. Just the U.S., just that last year. I remember when we spent $265 billion to clean up after 3 storms. We know that every year environmentally induced asthma costs the United States additional billions of dollars for children who are hospitalized every summer from environmentally induced asthma. We know the sea level rise predicted to occur by the end of the century. We learned this just a week ago. That sea level rise will now happen in the next 30 years, not at the end of the century. We know pollution, choking the atmosphere, kills 10 million people a year, globally, every year. We know that unprecedented extreme heat kills another 5 million. We know the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as the rest of the planet, and the permafrost, which contains an entire ice age of methane and carbon dioxide, is alarmingly thawing in Russia, Canada, Alaska, and across the Arctic Circle. We know that Antarctica is melting faster than we thought possible. The Thwaite Glacier, known as the Doomsday Glacier, has held the West Antarctic ice sheet in place for thousands of years. It could fracture, altering the shape of our world and threatening 250 million people in coastal cities from New York to Shanghai. Just go to an insurance company and ask them to show you the map of what it says about where cities will be 30 and 40 and 100 years from now. We know that climate is already a major driver of migration and displacement, with 30 million people internally displaced in 2020 alone and growing in numbers. We know that climate impacts threaten global security. I was just in Germany for the annual Munich Security Conference, where speaker after speaker acknowledged the threat multiplier effect of the climate crisis. Our generals at the Pentagon certainly know about it and talk about it. I want to quote a scientist directly, Johann Rockström of the Potsdam Institute, Rockström. He said, the most worrying thing is that the risk of cascades of climatic tipping points knocks over the next and starts an unstoppable rise in climate security risks. Greenland is rapidly melting, he said, slowing down the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, which pushes the monsoon further south, causing drought and fire in the Amazon, all triggering extreme climate security threats. In summary, he said, the scientific message is not climate-induced security risk will increase in the future, and that we are so far much more likely to underestimate the pace and the scale of change. My friends, we know with certainty that it is human activity causing this, and only human activity can change course. And we know, thanks to a landmark report that the IPCC released only 4 years ago, that to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis, we must limit global temperature to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are already at 1.2. We also know that some climate impacts are now irreversible. So the question at this point is not whether we can altogether avoid this crisis, it is whether we can just avoid the worst consequences. That is the grim choice that we have left ourselves because of procrastination, disinformation, fear, distortion, even lies. The test ahead of us is not just a political one. It's not a diplomatic challenge alone. It is a test literally pitting human nature against itself. So what is it that the science says we must do to address this challenge? Well, thanks to science, the mission could not be more clear. We have to slash emissions by a minimum of 45% by 2030, as I said earlier. If we do not, it will be near impossible to reach a pollution-neutral planet by mid-century. And barring a miracle, we are just going to blow by the 1.5 degrees. Currently, we are heading right now, as we sit here today, towards 2.7, because not enough is being implemented after Glasgow. And nowhere is it more true what is happening and the effects than here on this continent. 1/10 of a degree rise will really matter more here than in some other places. It matters to our ocean, which covers nearly 70% of Earth's surface and provides food for billions of people. You can't have a healthy planet, my friends, without a healthy ocean. And you cannot protect the ocean without addressing the climate crisis. With a 1.5 degree temperature rise, we may lose, according to the science, much of the world's coral reefs, small fisheries, and crustaceans, especially here in the Red Sea, home to some of the world's richest marine biodiversity. With a 2 degree temperature rise, we risk losing all coral reefs and the collapse of the entire ocean ecosystem. At 1.5 degrees, our staple crops, corn, rice, wheat, will be unpredictable and unstable, and in places like the Nile River Delta and sub-Saharan Africa, particularly affected. At 2 degrees, many of those crops will just wither and die. Tens of millions could starve. Well, we went to Glasgow with the planet on a potential collision course with a 2.8 degree total rise in temperature. That is what we were warned by the scientists before we went. And we were determined to leave Glasgow having kept alive the hope of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. You know what? We made significant progress. In fact, the International Energy Agency has told us that if all the commitments of COP26 are implemented, the rise in temperature of the planet would be limited to 1.8 degrees. Just think about that. The promises of Glasgow could keep us to 1.8 if we implement them. That promise, however, is a reprieve. It's not a resolution. But it's a lot closer to 1.5 degrees than we were at the beginning of 2021. And what that tells me, at least, and I hope tells you, is if we can bring other countries on board, we can win this battle. So in 2022 and throughout this decade, what is it that we have to do? 2 words: implementation plus. What does that mean? It means delivering on existing commitments that are not strong enough, raise the ones that are not strong enough, and create new commitments and efforts where none exist. With respect to nationally determined contributions, that's the lingo of the COPs. It's the amount every country pledges to undertake here. And that is a critical number which determines whether or not we are able to have a shot at holding on to the levels of, to the current capacity to be able to achieve our goals. So we know that climate is already putting us in a place where we have some of the toughest choices we've ever faced. And unfortunately, I want you to share with me the sense that with a 1.5 degree temperature rise, we stand to have literally catastrophe. And if we head towards the 2.7, which is where we're going now, then we are, I don't even want to begin to describe, and you have to read the science, it'll tell you exactly where we are. But implementation plus gives us a shot at achieving this. And let me try to be quite specific. In Glasgow, we achieved getting 65% of global GDP committed to hold the temperature of 1.5 degrees. That 65% represents the largest economies of the world. And so, obviously, if you have 65% that are in the fight, you've got 35% that have yet to come to that fight. And that leaves 35% of the world's economy that has to come more in line with science. That's the plus. That's the plus. There are many other commitments that require implementation. The Global Methane Pledge, a pledge to reduce methane emissions by 30% globally. The First Mover Coalition, a coalition of companies including Amazon and Volvo and Boeing and United, Apple, Salesforce, big companies came together and made a commitment that they're going to buy green. They're going to do what they can to guarantee that we have the ability to be able to meet this pledge. Declarations in support of zero emissions in shipping. Maersk, the largest shipper in the world, stepped up and said the next 8 ships that we build will be carbon-free. Volvo said the next steel they buy, 10% will be set aside, and they will guarantee that that 10% is steel that is green. Holcim Lafarge, the largest cement maker in the world, stepped up and said, we will make green cement. And they are already selling that green cement because they don't know whether or not, it's not because people are saying, oh, it's green. People are buying it because it's actually better cement. So my friends, private sector innovations such as these and other dramatic commitments have been made, and there has to be serious follow-through on each and every one of these. There's still much more that has to be done if we're going to keep 1.5 degrees alive. In international bodies addressing international aviation and maritime transportation, there are gains to be made. In international financial institutions, there are banks and asset managers who are now stepping up and saying that they will put trillions of dollars to work in this transition. With respect to finance, the developed countries need to make good on the finance goals that we set. And we have to all not only mobilize the billions of dollars, we have to succeed in aligning the trillions of dollars. So implementation plus, my friends, has to apply to all countries. Now, I want to assure you that principle of all countries has to also apply to the biggest emitters at the top of the chain, and that includes my country. We are number 2 in emissions. It is a principle that President Biden is committed to, and just last week he announced new steps in clean manufacturing. From low carbon production of the steel and aluminum we're going to put into our electric vehicles, to the wind turbines and solar panels, to the clean concrete that we need in order to upgrade our transportation system. We're committed. And Ford and GM, General Motors, have both made commitments that by 2030, half the cars they sell in America will be electric, and by 2035, all cars will be electric. This year, we hope very much, I'm sure you're following some of this in the newspapers, we hope to pass the legislation that will build on the infrastructure legislation that has already passed so that we can have the funding we need and the other efforts to clean up our own energy future and to make it cheaper for Americans to be able to put solar panels on their roofs and buy electric cars. We aren't alone, my friends, nor are you, as you pursue many efforts here, some of which President Sisi talked to me about today, along with Foreign Minister Shukri. But other countries are also responding. Chile is rewriting their constitution to confront what they call a climate and ecological emergency. Canada revisited its 2030 target and raised it from 30% to fully 45% by 2030 and maybe reaching for 50. Now even Alberta, the oil sands capital of Canada, is closing loopholes and tightening emission standards. There are signs of promise literally almost anywhere that you look in the world right now. But everyone must do more. And it isn't just the national commitments where the actions have to meet the words. We have to run a sprint to avoid the near-term tipping points, the points of no return. We don't know exactly where they are, but the scientists are telling us they're there. The prospect of the Arctic, irretrievable. The prospect of what I mentioned in the Antarctic, irretrievable. We also have to run a marathon to reach the mid-century goals and to reduce CO2 emissions. And right now, my friends, I just, having been part of this process for a long time now, I have something to measure it against. And I am telling you candidly, right now, too many people are avoiding the tough choices, period. Coal use went up 9% last year, with another 260 gigawatts of coal power in the construction pipeline in just China alone, not to mention other countries in the world. When, at the very time that's happening, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, tells us that we need to be shutting down 870 gigawatts of unabated coal power by 2030. Meanwhile, a fair number of countries are turning to unabated natural gas as a transition fuel. Now, it's okay to use natural gas as a legitimate transition fuel if you're really transitioning to something for a period of time. Burning natural gas produces fewer emissions than coal. So if you went to gas off coal, you're getting an immediate 50% reduction. We need that in the next 10 years. So that's okay. But since natural gas is composed mostly of methane, it presents a challenge when it leaks, and it does leak 5 to 10% in transportation, in storage, in usage. And unless it's fully abated, my friends, natural gas capacity will lock in decades of emissions when we should be focusing on deploying abundant, cheap, renewable energy. Much cheaper than that. Now, the problem is that obviously right now in too many places it is business as usual. People feel pressure and Since economies are competitive, people are reluctant sometimes to make choices that they have to. But the path of least resistance, which is what many people are taking, happens to also be the path of greatest destruction. So I don't know what to say to you except that we have to break the mold. We have to stop and take stock and do what you do if you're in the middle of an immediate where you feel everything descending around you and you take action. I want to underscore, I understand the economic pressure that different countries face in different ways in different parts of the world. And some countries are under pressure to pursue carbon-intensive energy because it's all they've got. But guess what? It shouldn't be all they've got. If this is truly an existential crisis, then the world needs to act like it's existential and make sure we're providing alternatives to some of those countries. And we need to make sure that industrial economies like my own, where people want to develop using the same sources of energy they've used for decades, that's before we understood the full weight and consequences of these choices. Now we understand them. And now we have an obligation to try to avoid compounding them. We cannot lock in future emissions by building new infrastructure that will pollute for the next 3 or 4 decades without dramatically scaling up the technology that will capture and store all of the greenhouse gases that infrastructure will emit. It's just common sense. And while considering how we do this for the long term, we also have to sprint and do what we can do today and tomorrow to limit temperature and emissions increase now in this decade. That is called fast mitigation. It's a series of emergency brakes that we actually have the ability to employ here to prevent the warming right now. We need to tackle methane. That's one. Methane is not expensive to try to control. It's not expensive to plug the leaks. You plug the wells, you plug the mines, you plug the leaks in the pipes. That's basic plumbing. We know how to do that, and we need to do that. We need to tackle other potent gases as well, eliminate deforestation, which is killing the very lungs of the planet. We need strong, rapid, and sustained cuts to methane and other superclimate pollutants, such as black carbon, soot, hydrofluorocarbons, and tropospheric ozone. All of them potent, shorter-lived pollutants, many times more powerful than CO2. Methane, when it's first released, up to 80 times more destructive than carbon dioxide. So my friends, we have a roadmap. We just need to follow it. We know what the science tells us we have to do. We have the power to do it. The question is, do we have the willpower to do it? The global methane pledge that was launched at the COP26, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, and several other agreements were all painstakingly drafted, written, and approved precisely to tackle these very pollutants I just mentioned and to end deforestation. That's the roadmap. Together, our job is to create the sense of urgency. Young people all over the world are demanding that sense of urgency be recognized and honored. And we have to summon the political will to follow through on the pledges and commitments we have already made. Knowing one thing above all, the world will not follow our advice, they will follow our example. So let me emphasize, that is particularly true for the major economies of the world, the largest emitters of the world. Remember I mentioned 20 of the biggest economies of the world are 80% of all the global emissions? 80%, 20 countries. No wonder some countries in Africa or South Asia or in the island states, vulnerable nations, are angry and frustrated. What those 20 countries do will largely determine the fate of the planet. So we have to share the burden, work together to ensure that every one of those countries has an accelerated transition to net zero. And one thing is paramount: this transition cannot be achieved without meaningful progress on securing more direct climate finance, including for adaptation, or without aligning the trillions of dollars for both mitigation and adaptation through stronger national policies. Let me just add, major financial institutions all around the world have already committed to invest trillions of dollars. But that money is not a giveaway. It's not what we call concessionary money. It's money that's ready to invest. Invest means put into a project where you hope to make money. And that money will not be deployed without bankable investments. We need research, development, demonstration, and deployment grants from governments, as well as blended finance, that is to say, bringing finance from different places, multilateral development banks, from philanthropy, from budgets of the wealthiest countries. And we need angel investments. We need venture debt and equity from venture capital firms. And by the way, there's about $1 trillion of venture capital, the record amount, now chasing these new technologies. It's imperative that in doing this, we adequately address the very legitimate concerns of less developed and vulnerable countries of the world. Not only must this transition be fast, but it's got to be fair. It's got to be done in a way that brings everyone along, in a way that looks out for the most vulnerable. And we have to, all of us, wrestle with the costs and realities, not just of mitigation, but of adapting to the perils of a warmer world. Last year, it was 131, 145 degrees in various parts of the world. People are not constructed to survive under those circumstances. Here in Africa, you don't need a crystal ball to see the urgency. It's all around you. 17 of the world's 20 most climate vulnerable countries are found right here on this continent. Rising temperatures and less predictable rainfall have already changed growing and planting seasons. Egypt gets 85% of its water from the Nile, and experts warn of a nationwide freshwater shortage by 2025. How and when we adapt is critical. Adaptation action means reducing vulnerability and strengthening resilience. Or put more bluntly, it really means protecting people and their homes, their neighborhoods, and their livelihoods. The Global Commission on Adaptation found that every dollar invested in adaptation could yield as much as $10 in net benefits. Here in Africa, with the world's fastest growing populations and fastest growing economies, adaptation, my friends, is lives saved. It's jobs created. It's common sense. So this is part of what we mean when we say there has to be a just transition. You have to leave no one behind. It's a challenge that threatens everyone in the world, and it can be solved in ways that will be able to benefit everyone in the world with a healthier, safer, cleaner planet. Critical efforts are now underway in Africa, for instance. Rwandan farmers are using climate information to make decisions on what to plant, when to plant it in the face of increasing temperatures and unpredictable rainfall, thereby averting loss and livelihood. Tunisia is protecting its port investments from rising sea levels and increasing flood risks. In other parts of the world, Jamaica is helping farmers better plan for storms and floods with better irrigation systems. Mexico is funding river basin preservation to protect drinking water for 45 million residents. In India, after deadly heat waves, they're painting the roofs white to reflect more of the sun's heat and cool the homes. That's adaptation. That's building resilience. These innovations prepare our people for impacts that, frankly, we just no longer can avoid. But these examples have to be multiplied and magnified all around the world. President Biden's emergency plan for Adaptation and Resilience, his Prepare plan, puts $12 billion on the table to help countries be able to do that. And we need our Congress in the United States to come together and help more than 500 million people in developing countries to achieve the global goal on adaptation that we all embrace. We stand ready to work with all parties and the Egyptian presidency to ensure that the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation is going to be effective. And we also need to fully operationalize something called the Santiago Network, which begins to address the question of loss and damage. The more capacity we have to adapt and recover, the better we're going to be prepared for the changes. My friends, we recognize that many of those living in developing countries and those who are most at risk on the front lines of this crisis, that all of them, we have to work with them, not only to adapt to climate impacts, but to seize the opportunity in the crisis. We are now redoubling our work to develop strong incentives so that all countries can make the clean energy choice. I said a moment ago that countries representing 35% of global GDP do not currently have targets that are aligned with keeping 1.5 degrees alive. Among their ranks are countries, you know who they are, that have extraordinary capacity, countries of remarkable innovation and ingenuity, peoples with rich histories of leading the way, nations that can create jobs and entire economies of tomorrow, making the most of the coming clean energy revolution rather than running away from it. Each and every one of those countries is a place where climate threats couldn't be more real or imminent. Thawing permafrost that I mentioned a moment ago, to the pollution that forces children to stay inside, literally stay indoors because of the quality of the air, to coral reefs and Amazon forests that are fast disappearing. The question is not whether those countries can be part of the solution. The question is how and when. We know that the future is cleaner and greener if we get there in time, and we can. There is a reason why in South Africa, Anglo American, the mining company, announced that they're developing a 290-ton demonstration hydrogen-powered truck. Why? Because zero-emission mining can bring the world critical minerals needed for energy transformation without harming the world around us. There's a reason why Airbnb just announced that 850,000 of its global listings now feature at least one electric vehicle charger as an amenity. There's a reason why the American renewable energy sector installed 27.7 gigawatts of utility-scale renewable power, the equivalent of almost 30 nuclear plants, and we marked $39 billion in investments just last year. And there's a reason why the world's largest professional job networking platform, LinkedIn, says that the fastest attribute that employers and workers are seeking everywhere and anywhere are green skills. A famous criminal was once asked why he robbed banks, and he replied, "That's where the money is." Well, the clean tech revolution is where the money is. And every country on earth stands to benefit. 2021 was a record-breaking year for climate tech companies. More than 165 billion raised. And looking to the future, we are talking about trillions of dollars aimed at technologies ranging from green hydrogen to battery storage to electrolyzers. Bill Gates is exploring a smaller, safer, zero-emission nuclear reactor. A startup in Iceland now is turning carbon dioxide into rocks, putting it into the ground. In short, the possibilities, my friends, are genuinely limitless. This is not a transition to be feared or a transition to run away from. It is a transformation to be seized and embraced and made the most of. Imagine powering this entire campus with solar for a few cents an hour, a kilowatt hour. Imagine driving an electric vehicle from here to Sharm on a single charge and recharging in minutes. Imagine a new global economy and countless new jobs and careers as we fully harness the endless, harmless power of the natural world, from the sun to the wind to the water. In one recent year, the fastest growing job in my country was wind turbine tech. Now, I mentioned third fastest. This is not science fiction. This is the world that we can have. My friends, the jobs, the investments, the opportunity in the future are in solving the climate crisis, not running away from it, not ignoring it, not pretending, but listening to the science. The Egyptian Book of the Dead rejects what it described as a, quote, smallness of imagination, an eye that sees no farther than its own lashes. I still believe that we can see beyond our own lashes and reach for a future where our planet isn't burning, but healing. I still believe that we can dream big, that our bravest, boldest imagination can take us towards a future that is worth passing down to our children and their children. Because in the end, my friend, that is literally what is at stake here. 6 years ago, I very proudly signed the Paris Agreement with my then 2-year-old granddaughter, Isabel, on my lap. Today, she is an energetic, a curious, and almost 8-year-old, and she and my other grandchildren are now old enough to ask questions as yours are, questions that deserve answers. Are they going to have clean air to breathe when they grow up? Will the 51% of the oxygen we get from the ocean still be produced by an ocean whose chemistry is changing faster than it has in millions of years? Will they be able to see a coral reef, walk through a rainforest, or even venture outside safely on a summer evening? In short, will we have left them a healthy planet on which they and billions of others can fulfill their potential? Will we live up to our most basic responsibility to leave behind a world better than we found it? These are questions I'm sure that every one of you shares as well. But it is time we provide answers in the affirmative. It is time that we show young people around the world that adults can actually do the job they were asked to do and put in position to do. It is time that we decide to listen to the science and to make those choices. That is the choice that we have to make as we lead up to COP27. And my friends, put that way, it is really the only choice that we can make. Thank you.